So, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome back. Well, I'm aware afternoon sessions can be a bit challenging, but we have an exciting topic to discuss. We have very exciting panelists, so we won't give you the chance to feel drowsy this afternoon. We will be looking at North Africa, and trying to answer some questions such as how did Islamic State expand into North Africa, how strong is the presence in the region right now, and what are the particular North African dynamics regarding the future of the ISIS in the region, in the countries of North Africa. Well, it was mentioned today a couple of times already. The presence of ISIS looks a bit fragile in North Africa, in particularly since it was ousted from its stronghold in Libya. So is this the beginning of the end of ISIS in North Africa, or is it just a temporary setback? This is another question that we should be looking at. And we will have three case studies, so to say, three countries which are relevant regarding the future developments concerning the ISIS surviving or being defeated. So we have Egypt, where actually the ISIS could gain territory by aligning with local jihadists basically in the Sinai Peninsula. We have Libya, where the ISIS has exploited the political chaos to expand and control territory. And we have Tunisia, which can be considered as a major reservoir for foreign fighters that are being recruited by the ISIS. So let me now introduce our panelist. To my right is Jasmine El-Gamal. She is a resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Brand Scofford Center on International Security, where she mainly covers narratives in the cycle of radicalization and violent extremism. She has worked for more than 7 years in the US Department of Defense with a focus on Middle East policies. To my left is Dr. Emna Ben Arab, a former Tunisian politician. She has she was represented in the Tunisian parliament until 2011. She's now teaching at the University of Sfax, mainly on security issues and international relations. And most importantly, currently she is heading a research which is being conducted by the Institute for Strategic Studies in Tunisia on foreign fighters. Basically, it's the first ever field study that's been worked on. And last but not least, we have Mohammed El-Jarh from Libya. He's a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council, and he's actually a very well-known expert on the developments in and around Libya since the revolution. He writes and comments with many international media outlets, and he is developing and producing many interesting policy and strategy papers. The latest one on the choice of Libya, for example, between the Islamists and autocrats. So let me now start with Emna Ben Arab and the case of Tunisia, which is obviously the single largest exporter of foreign fighters to the ISIS core regions, but also to Libya.
All right, thank you, Dr. Well, in my presentation, I'll try to measure the attractiveness of ISIS and other terror groups in Tunisia through two main indicators and some preliminary findings drawn from a study that we are conducting at the Tunisian Institute for Strategic Studies, based primarily on interviews we've been conducting with incarcerated foreign fighters in Tunisian prisons. So two indicators show that the appeal of terror groups in Tunisia is surprisingly high. The first one is the map of terror attacks. As you can see, this map covers the period between December 2012 and March 2017 and features more than 80 terrorist activities, ranging from high-profile attacks to thwarted attacks to preparations for attacks. And these terror activities were concentrated mainly on the western borders of the country, with 2013, 2014, and 2015 as being the most deadly years. The second indicator is related to the unprecedented wave of Tunisians joining foreign wars. But what we've recently found out that exploring this phenomenon of foreign fighters should go beyond the actual numbers of foreign fighters to their milieu, that is, their friends, their families, their neighbors, etc. And all the foreign fighters we interviewed, except for two women, enjoy the active support of their families who pay them regular visits and support them financially and morally inside the prisons. Also, they have sympathetic feelings from their friends and neighbors. And this, of course, shows that the radical milieu that sympathizes with the terrorist groups is a sizable one and represents a real challenge. It's no longer the foreign fighters, but beyond those foreign fighters, their families, their friends, their milieu in general. So will the defeat of ISIS bring an end to this radicalization process? We believe that the defeat of ISIS is usually seen as a straightforward goal associated with territorial loss, which is which is underway, and which is infusing some kind of optimism about the so-called post-ISIS era. But the situation is much more complex than that. First, ISIS is all at once a conventional army, a guerrilla force, and a global terrorist network whose defeat requires more than pushing it out of territories it had occupied. And second, ISIS is simply an example of how the jihadist movement has shown a surprising capacity to morph into various shapes and forms and to change its strategies accordingly, testifying to our failure as researchers, as perspectivists, as politicians, to predict its skillful evolution and proliferation. So the contraction of ISIS does not mean an end to the jihadi threat, because not only is ISIS preparing to relocate, but mainly because the scope of its radicalization process, which involves an ideological, theological component and a structural psychological component, has reached an unprecedented number of Muslims around the world, which makes it a long-term war that lies in different battlefields. Well, the situation is particularly dangerous for countries like Tunisia, whose foreign fighter population is surprisingly high. The dispersal of ISIS fighters implies three things. It implies a surge of foreign fighters returning to Tunisia who may come back with a mission, who may come back to carry out attacks or facilitate financial and recruitment activity at home. It means also new flows of foreign fighters to nearby hotspots such as Libya, which will add to its chaotic situation and to its being a springboard toward Tunisia and other neighboring countries. And the third point is this sizable radical milieu that needs to be monitored. So the territorial loss of ISIS might temporarily deprive Tunisians of a destination, but will not help put an end to the radicalization process in all its forms, called by ICCT researcher Alex Smith the conveyor belt. That is, conditions that help one to move from being empathetic to being sympathetic to providing active support to becoming an actor. So it is very crucial that an accurate understanding of this, of the complex nature of the phenomenon is reached. Currently, there is no, especially speaking about my country, there is no contextualized understanding of the root causes of this phenomenon. And this lack of understanding is leading to quick fixes through a series of piecemeal security-focused policies rather than to strategic solutions based on an integrated approach that takes into account the multifaceted, multidimensional nature of the threat. The Tunisian Institute for Strategic Studies, in an attempt to understand this phenomenon of radicalization within the Tunisian context, has been carrying out a series of interviews with prisoners convicted with terror crimes in Tunisian prisons. So far, 70 men and 3 women inmates and 30 key actors have been interviewed. And when we started this work, we were looking for trends or patterns that help us demystify this phenomenon, but ended up realizing that the main pattern is the absence of a pattern, and we were left with with as many life trajectories as a number of interviewees. Nevertheless, there is some common ground shared by all interviews and that include one or more of the following factors. So there is a strong feeling among these, this is common among all these foreign fighters, a strong feeling of injustice. So for them, rights have become dreams, and even dreams are dashed or unattainable. And here they evoked bad governance and corruption as being responsible for the lack of economic opportunities and high unemployment rate, especially among graduates. Second, a deep-seated feeling of hatred towards the police and security forces. Most of them evoke their own experiences or someone else's experiences of injustice and abuse by authorities, and not poverty, which had driven them toward embracing the Islamic State as being the land of rights and justice. 3, frustration with political authorities, mainly during the Troika period. All of them mentioned by name political parties and political figures, including members of parliament, who encouraged them to travel to Syria, which was portrayed to them as an act of inward solidarity that is neither unethical nor illegal. And most of them claimed that they were therefore unaware that fighting in foreign wars or being part of ISIS propaganda, like liking or sharing a terror group's Facebook page, was a crime. Most of them have no sense of belonging to Tunisia. When we ask them to prioritize their belonging to an entity or group, very few mentioned Tunisia in the first place, and sometimes their belonging to a football team comes first. The failure of the education system, which, according to them, obfuscates religious education and history, devalues the individual and the effort, and downplays critical thinking. Domestic violence is dominant among radicalized women. Almost the 3 women which we interviewed, they said that they were victims to domestic violence. They were beaten, they were raped, and usually behind us there is the brother and the father. Hatred of and lack of trust in the West. So Western intervention in the MENA region is a primary source of anger and grievance for them. They all mentioned the perceived double standards of the Western powers, and all of them mentioned the US as being the evil power implementing an evil agenda in the region. And for all of them, the continued occupation of Palestine and the immunity of Israel remains a festering wound, which makes the Islamic State look like a viable alternative to regain the greatness of the Muslim civilization. Well, these findings, though preliminary, seem to confirm findings of a qualitative study carried out by IRI in Tunis. It was carried out in foreign fighters' neighborhoods, not the actual foreign fighters, but their friends and families, in 5 Tunisian towns, and based on 25 focus groups, 12 persons in each group. And according to this milieu, winning the war against radicalization will depend essentially on dismantling extremist ideologies through education and on providing real alternatives for change and advancement for the youth that go a step further beyond the denouncement of terrorist activities or security-centered measures and the military operations currently underway. So finally, it's worth noting here that all members of these groups demonstrated empathy toward foreign fighters and shared their grievances, which shows that the foreign fighter phenomenon represents only the tip of a huge iceberg. Thank you.
Emna, thank you. Thank you in particularly for sharing us the preliminary results of your research. So let's move now to the neighboring, to the challenging country, Libya, where the situation looks totally different. So Libya is less a country where foreign fighters are being recruited, but more a destination for foreign fighters.
Yes.
So Mohammed El-Jarh knows better.
Thank you, Janan. I was asked to address a number of questions, and they revolve around, first, ISIS presence or structure when it started in 2014. As possibly many of you know, that Daesh lost its territory in Libya, and at the moment they are scattered around the country. So I'll be giving you an overview of their presence, their initial presence, and the structure that they had in Libya, and the links to the center as well. And the second one is the threat level of Daesh in Libya to the region, whether be it Europe or neighboring countries, including Tunisia or the Sahel region, Egypt, etc. And then the third question that was posed by the organizers was the appeal of Daesh within Libya. How much of a base does Daesh have in Libya, or support or sympathy, especially among young people? And the fourth one is survival. Will Daesh, despite the fact that it has lost its territory in Libya, be able to survive the loss of territory and also the pressure that is being exerted on it, as we have already learned in the previous sessions in Syria and Iraq. So very quickly, I'll give an overview of the start of Daesh. So as we all know, that on the 29th of June, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi emerged. And soon after, actually, the first signs of Daesh in Libya were spotted in July 2014. So June, July, that was there wasn't much difference in times. However, the actual establishment of the wilaya in Darna was in October, the 3rd of October specifically in 2014, and then it was accepted mid-October by Baghdadi, or their bay'ah was accepted by Baghdadi. And the main group that established Daesh in Darna is Shabab Jaysh al-Islam, and it is basically made up of Al-Battar Brigade, or Katibat al-Battar al-Libya, which was basically fighting in Syria, but then returned to Libya and was split between Darna and Benghazi. However, it's very important to point about earlier events that have helped the establishment of Daesh, not just in Libya, but also in Syria and Iraq. And I think events in Libya have played a major role there. Libya was one of the factories for Daesh. Following the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime, many of the revolutionary leaders and some of the leaders of the transition in Libya said that we will support the Syrian revolution and we will help overthrow the Gaddafi regime. And they gave around $100 million to the Syrian opposition. And they have also started to train foreign fighters in Libya, and also ship pickup trucks, aircraft guns, even tanks, etc. And they were all going where? To Syria to help the opposition in the fight against Bashar al-Assad. These weapons were one of the initials, or some of the initial weapons that Daesh used either in Syria or in Iraq and elsewhere. And there are key figures in Libya that are linked to some Islamist politicians in Tunisia as well, who have helped bring those fighters into Libya, train them and transfer them with the help of who? Obviously Turkey and Qatar were heavily involved, but also NATO was witnessing all of this, and it was happening under their nose, and they knew about all of this activity. No one seemed to mind at the time. So I thought that's very important to point out in the case of Libya. So thirdly, I will talk about the importance of Libya to Daesh. Many people were asking the question, Libya, how does Daesh or the leadership of Daesh see Libya? And I think that became clear in January 2015 when there was like a white paper that was disseminated by the leadership at the core, where they described to their followers that Libya is extremely important because of the location, because of the wealth, because of the weapons, the instability that's in there, and that it is, as was pointed earlier, it could be the gateway for their project into the region and other parts of the world, but also it would be a fallback option for them in case they come under pressure in Syria and Iraq. And the potential for that is definitely there, despite the fact that they have lost territory in Libya, in Darna and in Sirte. But Libya is a huge country. The south is borderless, governless, and they could move there and they could regroup there anytime there. And because of this importance, here I'm going to talk about the link between the core and Daesh in Libya. So al-Baghdadi decided to dispatch some key figures to Libya to help establish the wilayat or the provinces in Libya. And some of these leaders included Abu Nabil al-Anbari, for example, or he was known as Wissam Najm Zubaydi, an Iraqi national, was one of the military commanders who led the group's expansion in Iraq, and he was reportedly killed in a US airstrike on Darna on November 12, 2015. There is also Abu Habib al-Jazrawi, a Saudi national, and reportedly filled the role of the wali of the city of Darna very early on. Another leader that was dispatched by the center of Daesh is Abu al-Bara al-Azadi, a Yemeni national. He was reportedly killed in an Egyptian airstrike in February 2015. The airstrike was in retaliation to the killing of Copts in Sirte by Daesh. And then you have Turki al-Bin Ali, who is considered to be one of the spiritual leaders, and he was obviously spotted preaching and giving sermons in areas in Syria and Iraq, but also spotted in Darna and also in Sirte till the very recent events there. Daesh did not waste any time. So immediately in Darna, they set up police, courts, they set up education departments, tax departments. They were giving compulsory religious lessons. They were carrying out basically a very extreme and radical social re-engineering exercise in the city of Darna. Libya being a very divided country, a country that has many competing factions, each competing for legitimacy, etc., no one was actually paying attention to this, and everyone was more interested in the ongoing political and armed fight over resources and power in Libya. And also the link between Daesh in the center and also to Libya was very clear in their propaganda, the way that they produced their media from Libya, and also their fighting and their, if you like, terror tactics as well. They were very similar to those in Syria and Iraq. So there were clear and evident links between the provinces in Libya, or the wilayat in Libya, and Daesh at the center. However, obviously, even within Libya, the setup of Daesh in various parts of the country was pretty much localized. Daesh was, in a way, very good at carrying out assessment of who to target and who not to target, or where to start and where not to start. So I will go very quickly over the formation of Daesh in, for example, Darna and Benghazi. So in Darna and Benghazi, Daesh was formed by returning fighters, mainly from Al-Battar Brigade, as I said, that was fighting in Syria, and they were mainly located in the eastern city of Darna, but some of them were also in Benghazi. Obviously, they've managed to coexist with other extremist groups like Ansar al-Sharia in Benghazi, Ansar al-Sharia in Darna, and also the Darna Mujahideen Shura Council in the city of Darna. They coexisted for a little bit, but then things were heating up because Daesh thought that they were the only rightful group to actually rule, and everyone should join them or be fought. And that is what they started to do, is they started to target the leaders of other groups. So fighting erupted in the city of Darna in 2015 between the Darna Mujahideen Shura Council and Daesh after the killing of the Darna Mujahideen Shura Council's leader, Nasser al-Akir, in that incident. That has led to the expulsion of Daesh from Darna. So Daesh was defeated in Darna, and some of them escaped to Sirte, where they were already starting to set up there, and many of the leaders managed to move to Sirte. They had a fallback option in that case. But notice that in Darna, or we noticed that in Darna, so Daesh is gone. Who was in control? It was the Darna Mujahideen Shura Council, another extremist group. And also the conflict in the city of Darna did not end. The city of Darna until today, since the defeat of Daesh in 2015, until today is under siege by the Libyan National Army that wants the Darna Mujahideen Shura Council to be outside. So there is a little bit of a mass punishment against the people of Darna by the Libyan National Army, who thinks that this group should either surrender or the siege will continue. But that is creating a radicalization process of some sort within the city of Darna as well. People are feeling, they feel the blame for something they didn't do, and now they're sympathizing with the other extremist group that's in control of the country, of the city. And very quickly on Daesh in Sirte. So the origin of Daesh in Sirte is slightly different. It was mainly Al-Faruq Brigade, which is from the city of Misrata mainly. And it was one of the revolutionary brigades that helped overthrow the Gaddafi regime, and obviously was cooperating with NATO and Western countries and others who have helped overthrow the Gaddafi regime. And there is also a little bit of misconception that I hear Dr. Tariq Mitri earlier mention, is that there are many Gaddafi loyalists with Daesh. There are actually more February 17 revolutionaries with Daesh than there are Gaddafi loyalists. Maybe there are some Gaddafi loyalists. But the question is, why did Daesh choose Sirte? Sirte was deprived from having, because it was connected to Gaddafi and it's his hometown, they were deprived from having any weapons at all, like within the city, and the only force that was securing the city was from outside the city. It was from the city of Misrata. It was Al-Faruq Brigade, but there was also another brigade called 166. But when Al-Faruq decided to make bay'ah with al-Baghdadi, They started to fight the other Misratan group, and then you had fighters coming from Derna, you had foreign fighters from Tunisia as well joining them. They grew stronger, and they pushed the Misratan group out of Sirte, and the Misratans basically went back to their city, Misrata. Now the Sirtawis, the people in Sirte, were left with nothing to defend themselves with. They tried to have an uprising very early on, but they were crushed. People were crucified. There was also the Salafists, some of the like the Quietists and the Salafist movement within the city. The Quietists, I would say, and the purist Salafists tried to lead a revolt. The Furjan tribe within the city tried to lead a revolt, but they did not have the weapons and the capabilities to fight Daesh off. And as a result, Daesh took control of the city after crushing it. And that is the case of Sirte. And also Sabratha is another very interesting case, and I think it was very interesting because of its links, obviously, to Tunisia. And although that the Daesh initially had links to figures from the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, the former Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, but they were mainly made up of Tunisian fighters. So that was the factory for the project for the Tunisia province was actually happening in Sabratha. So many people were training there, many of the leaders were there, and it was mainly made up, this is another interesting bit, is many of Ansar Sharia Tunis actually joined Daesh in this case. In Darna, Ansar Sharia was split. Some of them joined Daesh, some of them decided to stay in neutral. In Benghazi, Ansar Sharia did not join Daesh as in other places. So these are very distinct differences within the Libyan context there. Just to also mention why Darna, why was Darna another key target for Daesh? Darna has obviously a history of jihadism, and it was the #1 city that exported foreign fighters to Iraq to fight off the American occupation, and many of the people or the young people from Darna who joined the resistance in Iraq were actually volunteering for suicide missions. They wouldn't want to fight, they just wanted to immediately go and conduct suicide missions as well. So there is a history there, but the history goes back even to 1980s and 90s. I'm so sorry, am I out of time?
A couple of minutes.
Okay, I think I'm almost done. Very quickly on the way ahead. Now, Daesh territorially was defeated in Libya. And that goes to the point, is the military defeat enough? I don't think it is. Why? Because the environment that gave rise to Daesh is there in the case of Libya. And I think it will be there in other parts as well, in Syria, in Iraq, and so on. So the environment, unless we deal with this environment, unless we deal with the polarization within Libya, we will not be able to defeat Daesh finally. And Dr. Tariq Mitri mentioned important points earlier. He said that there are deep political issues. And I also will mention some of the points that Dr. Amna mentioned. There is an issue with identity in Libya. Libya has never had in its history a proper, frank, open discussion about what it really means to be a Libyan. Never. Not even since independence, etc. There was never, ever an exercise of talking about what it really means to be a Libyan. So the identity is extremely important. There is the issue of governance, distribution of wealth, a social contract within Libya, the participation of youth and women, and the conflict is making these issues extremely difficult to achieve. And these should be the different ideas, the different realities that we should be creating to combat extremism. And also on the external factors, the same people who have helped overthrow Gaddafi currently are engaged in a proxy war within Libya. They're competing interests. One side you have Turkey, you have Qatar, the other side you have Egypt or UAE and somewhat Saudi Arabia, and then Italy and France and the United States. Each one is doing their own thing in Libya, only exacerbating the situation. And then, so there is a huge problem, not just within these countries, but also with the international system as a whole, despite the many conversations that we have about defeating Daesh and so on, but we can't seem to get our priorities right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mohammed. I'm sure there will be many questions to you regarding the different levels that are engaged into this ISIS issue. But let's, before we open up for the discussion, give the floor to Jasmine Al-Gamal, and she will talk about the situation in the Sinai.
Thank you so much. And I'll try to keep this fairly short so we can have more time for questions and answers. But as you've heard in previous panels earlier today, the strategy of the so-called Islamic State is predicated on a few different pillars. One of them is territorial control, ideological superiority, and unpredictability. Unpredictability, particularly in the West, where their goal is to create such a rift between Muslims and non-Muslims that all Muslims are viewed as a potential threat. And you see that in places particularly like Paris and Berlin and the US right now. So in Egypt, what we have is a case of territorial control, mainly in the Sinai. And just very briefly to talk about the context within ISIS has flourished in the Sinai, we should talk briefly about the security situation in Egypt in general. So in the years following the Arab Spring and the revolution that toppled Hosni Mubarak, there was just immense chaos in Egypt. The security situation was terrible. And, Egyptians got to the point where they were just really tired. There was extreme fatigue when it came to security in Egypt. And partly running on that platform, former Defense Minister Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was elected president in 2014 and basically campaigned on a very strong platform of security. So if you look at Egypt right now and you look at the incredibly dire economic situation, he still has been able to follow through, despite some controversial tactics, has been able to follow through on his promise to Egyptians that they would feel safe again in the streets, that they wouldn't have to worry about random terrorist attacks in Cairo or Alexandria or any of the major cities. And so far he has been able to follow through. I myself have been to Egypt several times over the last few years, and you can absolutely see a very, very tangible shift in the security situation, but also in people's comfort level and their confidence in the government when it comes to security measures. So the Sinai is a completely different story, and there's sort of an advantage to that when it comes to the way the Egyptian government is dealing with it, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But just to give a very brief history of ISIS in the Sinai Peninsula. So originally their name was Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, and in 2014 they changed their name to Wilayat Sinai, and pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, and since then have carried out dozens of attacks, particularly targeting two groups, security forces and Christians. So the more high-profile attacks over the last few years, and I'm sure everyone in this room has heard of at least one or two of these, was a bomb attack that killed Egypt's prosecutor general in Cairo 2 years ago, for which they claimed responsibility. There was a large-scale assault in 2015 on the town of Sheikh Zouaid, and the militants were eventually driven back, but not before about 100 militants were dead and 17 soldiers were killed in the fighting. And the reason I state these numbers is just to give a sense of the difficulty that the Egyptian security forces are having with what is seemingly not a very large organization or not a large presence, but because of the tactics that Muhammad mentioned earlier, some of their tactics like suicide bombings and simultaneous attacks in different places make it quite challenging for the Egyptian government to deal with it. In October of 2015, the group also claimed responsibility for bringing down the Russian Metrojet Flight 9268, which I'm sure you heard about, but it was carrying about 224 passengers from Sharm el-Sheikh on the way to St. Petersburg, and just a really shocking incident, and which Wilayat Sinai claimed responsibility for, and which President Putin later confirmed that it was indeed a bomb that brought it down. So that was a pretty big turning point for them. And of course, again, as Muhammad mentioned earlier, there was the tragic beheading of 21 kidnapped Coptic Christian workers in Libya. So these are just to give you a sense of some of the the high-profile attacks and the capabilities that the organization has that they've been able to foster in just a few short years since 2014. In terms of the support of core ISIS for Wilayat Sinai in the peninsula, ISIS launched a massive media campaign in support of this organization in Egypt, which included a lot of videos that were coming out, like with a lot of themes that we've heard about before, but it was very much in support of this new organization and this new group in Sinai, and it appeared to be an attempt to reorient the group's focus away from from Syria and Iraq, where they were coming under heavy military pressure, and towards North Africa. And it also could have been a way to attract more recruits to the cause by implying that Israel was next on its list of targets, so trying to use the always popular anti-Israeli rallying cry to get more recruits. And the themes of this massive media campaign were very familiar ones, and ones that you've heard about before throughout the day, but anti-democracy, pro-Sharia law, tying the land to religion, so talking about the Sinai as the land of the prophet Moses, and portraying the country's leaders as puppets of the West and enemies of Islam. And in this particular case, referring to President Sisi as the new pharaoh. So in terms of strength, estimates of their strength hover around 1,000 to 1,500 fighters. And again, as we mentioned earlier, the tactics suggest not just lip service from the organization, the core organization, but actual genuine support and training and transfer of knowledge from the fighters in Iraq and Syria to the fighters in Egypt. So the group has been particularly brutal in their targeting of Sinai's Christians, and it's just last month, for example, gunmen shot about 7 Christians in the span of 1 month, including shooting a man in front of his own mother and then burning down the house afterwards. Incredibly brutal, horrifying tactics. And it's caused a massive flow of Christians from some of these towns that are being targeted in the Sinai to others seeking refuge in churches, and just causing a real existential crisis for Coptic Christians in Egypt. So, in terms of popular support, and this is something, again, that we'll talk about in a few minutes, but the Sinai has generally been kind of like removed from Egypt as a country. Most Egyptians aren't really aware of what's happening in Sinai. They kind of know that something is going on. They know that there's terrorism, but it's not something that affects their day-to-day life. And so this has a couple of implications, but one of them is that the residents in the Sinai Peninsula just feel really marginalized, and they feel abandoned and betrayed by their government that's supposed to protect them, in some cases by the Christian church that's supposed to protect them in terms of the Christian population. And so both the marginalization and this sense of betrayal and neglect have allowed recruiting to be a little bit easier in that sense. Like the residents are more, susceptible, I guess, to recruitment by the organization. So quickly, a couple of things about how the government is dealing with the threat. So the numbers that I've seen most recently vary between 20 and 25 soldiers that the Egyptian government has deployed to the area to deal with this threat. And they've ramped up their offensive against the group quite dramatically, especially in the last couple of years. In 2014, after a suicide bombing left about 31 soldiers dead, President Sisi declared a state of emergency in the peninsula and described it as a nesting ground for terrorism and terrorists. So he takes the threat extremely seriously. In January 2015, he created a unified military command to combat terrorism in the Sinai, which the unit is basically responsible for all counterterrorism efforts east of the Suez Canal. A couple of implications, and I'll close with this to give time for a discussion of the location of the Sinai Peninsula. I've talked a little bit about the fact that it's out of the public eye, and so it gives the president a lot more leeway in terms of how he's dealing with the threat. So I'm sure you can imagine if this was happening in Cairo or in Alexandria and people were seeing it in front of their faces, that the president would have a lot more pressure and would feel a lot more scrutiny in terms of how he was dealing with the threat. But because Sinai is out of the public eye for the most part, he is able to kind of learn by doing. I mean, the government hasn't had an incredibly clear strategy for how it's facing this threat and how it's combating the threat, but they've been able to kind of, by trial and error, try to get to a point where they are dealing directly with the threat in a way that minimizes casualties. But their tactics, because they're so haphazard at times, have resulted in great tensions between the security forces in the peninsula and local tribal leaders whose support they need, but who have, the relationship just hasn't been that smooth over the last couple of years. The other significant implication of the location is, of course, the proximity to Israel. And this actually works out as an advantage to Egypt in a way, because Israel has seen this ramping up of terrorist activity in the Sinai. Of course, it's extremely concerned, which means that security cooperation and intelligence cooperation between the Egyptians and the Israelis has become incredibly strengthened over the last couple of years. There's more coordination, more cooperation with the Egyptians, in ways that are actually quite surprising. For example, the number of Egyptians are only allowed to have a certain number of soldiers in the Sinai based on the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, and it's only enough to kind of maintain the peace in the Sinai. But because of what's been happening in the last few years, the Israelis have actually allowed Egyptians to ramp up their security presence in the Sinai to combat this terrorist threat. And that way, it's partly securing Israel's parameters as well. So, for example, in July of 2013, Israel approved the deployment of 2 additional infantry battalions in Al Arish and Sharm el-Sheikh after terrorists attacked a bus full of workers there. They killed 3 people and injured about 17. And so we're seeing this ramping up in cooperation between the Israelis and the Egyptians, and similarly, increased support from the Americans as well, where the type and amount of military assistance to the Egyptians is increasingly becoming more focused towards counterterrorism and dealing with this threat of the Islamic State, Wilayat Sinai in Egypt. So I think I'll close there just to give us more time to discuss.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I want to thank my panelists for these really exciting interventions. We have, of course, there are many questions regarding Tunisia and with the foreign fighters and the returnees. There is the case of Libya, where obviously ISIS is kind of being defeated, but not finally. So there is the danger of re-establishing itself and new territories. And there is this Sinai case where obviously a strong local jihadist group is holding the power in behalf of the ISIS. So I'd like to invite you now to join in, and we start maybe here with the gentleman in the first row.
Well, I have first to congratulate all the speakers this afternoon. They have done a very, very good job. Then my question is related to the fact that between this morning and this afternoon, I have to know the reasons behind the rise of Daesh or IS in either the Mashriq countries or the Maghreb countries. You gave me the impression now that in the Maghreb countries, Daesh, if maybe I am mistaken, please correct me, Daesh is on the rise, while in the morning in the Mashraq countries, we have seen that Daesh is going down. Between the two experiences, we have to know the reasons behind the development of Daesh. Either the rise of Daesh as it is in the Maghreb countries, or the decline of Daesh as it is in the Mashraq countries. Thank you.
I have two over there, and then I'll give it back. Ayman, and then the gentleman is the white shirt. Or other way around, works also. Please.
Well, thank you very much. I have a question and maybe an addition to Yasmin and Yasmin's paper. Thank you very much. I enjoyed your paper, but I have a question relating to, well, the security situation in Egypt. Don't you think that somehow Sinai recently has, well, arrived in Cairo itself? So, I mean, Sisi may be credited with some sort of progress on some fronts, but nonetheless, more recently, I think numerous people may think that Sinai has sort of caught up with them in Cairo itself. I mean, some of the issues you mentioned yourself. Now, the addition is, I think, if I remember correctly, we need to go back to the Mubarak days at least when you talk about Sinai, because there has been sort of an insurrectional climate in Sinai in 2007, 8, 9, 10, and so on and so forth, on which it seems to me the later events have been grafted. So that brings us back to a more general issue, which is that there has been, and you mentioned that yourself, a degree of alienation, estrangement of parts of the population, very often called tribal, without that anybody really means what tribal means, but anyway, the so-called tribal population was marginalized. And that, of course, is very similar to what we seem to see in other places, like in Tunisia, like in Libya and elsewhere, that if, and that's why I bring it in, because if we don't go back to the Mubarak days and this alienation of parts of the population, we may not be able to seize the actual mobiles and reasons why there is something like Daesh today.
My question's directed to Mohammed. Thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it, and I think it was good you helped dispel some myths about the Islamic State presence in Libya. I want to ask about two specific things. One is the interaction of Ansar al-Sharia Libya with Islamic State presence. My second question relates to the composition of the Islamic State in Libya, which is that looking at many of the documents that are been found when Islamic State has left behind bases in Sirte, there are a lot of sub-Saharan Africans who turn up in the ranks. Now, these are mostly migrant blacks who are already in Libya, and what are the reasons you think they joined Islamic State in Libya?
Okay, let me maybe start with Mohammed, and then we make the round this way.
Okay. I think very quickly on the point of is on the rise or not. In the case of Libya, with the current environment, if it is not Daesh, it is someone else. So it doesn't matter who will fill the vacuum because of the insecurity, because of the lack of a system, because of the intervention that didn't have any post-intervention strategy. So with the current environment in Libya, even if Daesh is defeated by some other group, there will come another group that will inflict much injustice, that will not most likely establish an inclusive system, that will embark on an exclusionary course of politics, etc., and that will give rise to some other forms of violent extremism or violent action-oriented groups. So that's very briefly on that point. Interaction between Ansar Sharia and Islamic State, I've touched on that very briefly, I guess. It was different from one part to another. In the case of Darna, as I said, when the wilaya was established and Daesh started to ask the people to make bay'ah, including armed groups within the city, Ansar Sharia was split. Some parts of Ansar Sharia thought that Ansar Sharia was not exciting enough or was not jihadi enough. and they decided to go with Islamic State or with Daesh. And there was a proper split. Now, the other interesting point that I did not mention is after the defeat of Daesh, Ansar Sharia in Darna, when Daesh was strong, the ones that stayed independent and didn't make bay'ah, I was told by sources within the Darna Mujahideen Shura Council that they were around 150 members, around up to 200. After the defeat of Daesh at the hands of the Darna Mujahideen Shura Council, some of the Islamic State fighters escaped to Sirte, some were imprisoned, but others sought refuge with Ansar Sharia in Darna. And the number increased from around 150 to 100 to about 450, 500, according to the same sources in Darna. And it was different in the case of Sirte. Al-Faruq Brigade was known also as Ansar Sharia, and the entire brigade was the basis or the core of Daesh there. And then you had Ansar Sharia Tunis as well in the case of Sabratha, becoming the Daesh or Islamic State in Sabratha. And they launched the attack in Ben Gurdan as well in Tunisia, where they attempted to overtake the city after the US airstrike that destroyed their plans for a Tunisian province or a Tunisian wilaya. With regards to, very quickly, on the sub-Saharan Africans, but also the Egyptians, there are many stories that now we are hearing from Darna, from Sirte, from other places. In the case of Darna, I think there was one Egyptian who was helping or was in charge with the tax collection and so on, and there was an incident, and I think similar incidents happened elsewhere, where he actually took the money and he escaped as well in the city of Darna. And you have other Egyptians who are in Libya for economic reasons, and basically they are holding prisoners or they're just doing some certain duties, not necessarily doing leadership roles or key commander roles, etc. So you had people who are there because they did get paid as well, including African migrants there as well. But I think that represents a danger for the Sahara region now that Daesh is actually now the bulk of Daesh's activity is in the south, and they are regrouping. Now there is escalation in Libya happening. The groups are now, after the defeat of Daesh, groups are now turning against each other, and they are fighting again, creating the very same environment that gave rise to Daesh, and they are moving to the south where they can do, I think, pretty much what they want unless someone intervenes, and I think the United States and France are trying to do something about it. Thank you.
Well, about the rise of Daesh, similar to Libya, in Tunisia, it's not specifically the rise of Daesh, it's the rise of extremism. From our interviews, ideologically speaking, these people are not sophisticated. They did not choose ISIS for ideological reasons, but for a pragmatic goal, which is the implementation of Sharia law and the establishment of their Islamic utopia. It's not a question of differences in ideology between Daesh or Al-Qaeda or other groups, but it's just the end result of embracing such a state. And Daesh is appealing because it was projecting this message of strength and victory. And if there is, as Muhammad said, if there is no Daesh, there will be something else.
Jasmine, there was also a direct question to you.
Yes, just very quickly on that, the rise of ISIS in some places and their decline in other places. I actually think it's quite natural to see, as they are more pressured in places like Syria and Iraq, and as countries have more resources to deal with them, they're squeezed out of the countries that they're currently in or that they started in, they're going to try to find other countries that maybe have less sophisticated security apparatus or less resources or more chaos, security vacuums and things like that to fill them. And I think what happens in that case, like for example, I was talking to some Egyptian security officials, and they were extremely concerned about the international response or lack of response, as they saw it, to the situation in Libya. because they see it as a direct threat to or an indirect threat to them, but eventually a threat to them. If ISIS is not dealt with in Libya, then Libya becomes a threat to Egypt and so on. And so you see them kind of hopping from one place to the other. What I think you'll see, in my opinion, time is not on their side. This is an organization, ISIS, with limited resources. They're being squeezed financially, security-wise. They don't have territory. They hardly have any territory left, and their sources of finances are being squeezed by governments around the world. And so what I think that you'll start seeing over the next few months and years is the organization is going to continue to shrink in terms of numbers and territory, but they're going to do two things. One is basically lend their name or provide their name to any organization out there that wants to be recognized on the world stage. So you can have 10 people in a country that decide they want more resources and more fame and more power, so they just say, we pledge allegiance to ISIS, and all of a sudden ISIS has a new branch somewhere. And the other thing they are doing, which you'll see more of, is basically providing a manual for lone wolf attacks in the West as a way of destabilizing the West. And you've seen that with the truck driver in Nice who rammed into, you only need one person and you need on a truck, and they provide very specific instructions in their magazines. And basically, so to foster the illusion of growth and strength, I think you're going to see these two things, but it is an illusion in the end because their actual organization is shrinking. So I hope that answers your question. And then in the back, in terms of whether the Sinai has caught up in Cairo, it has the risk that President Sisi faces here is that the longer this crisis goes on in the Sinai, the more likely it is to gain prominence and cause an embarrassment to him. I mean, why can't the Egyptian government defeat 1,000 fighters in the Sinai? It doesn't bode well for confidence. In the system and in the government, but again, as long as it's contained in the Sinai, I just don't see it becoming that much of a concern to the average Egyptian, so to speak, in Cairo. I just don't see it happening. And in terms of alienation of certain parts of the population, I think it's a tactic that's been used by governments and terrorist organizations alike. I mean, there's always a very convenient factor in scapegoating a minority population. That said, I do think that President Sisi has really, really made an effort to at least outwardly or superficially send a message to Christians in Egypt, basically that they belong, that they shouldn't be, worried. He goes and celebrates like Christmas Mass, which is it's kind of an unusual thing, but it's a step that he's trying to take to reassure the Christian population in Egypt. It remains to be seen whether that superficiality will actually trickle down to a change in policies. That hasn't happened yet, but I think he's trying, at least outwardly, to set the tone in the positive direction.
So let's start with the second round. This is the gentleman here in the front, second with the white shirt, the lady, and the gentleman in the very back. So,
okay, thank you. I have a question relating to the situation in south of Libya. Mr. Mohammed, you say that ISIS is defeated in Libya now. But what do you think about the existence of Wilayat Fezzan? It says to have 2,000 or more fighters in it, and it is controlling a large zone in south of Libya.
Two questions. The first to Mohammed. The weapon shipments from Libya to Syria were a bit more complicated than presented. When they started big time in 2012 and went through Turkey, it was a highly contested area inside Syria, Tawhid Brigade, Farouk Brigade and the others. Everybody wanted to get some, while Daesh only surfaced and confessed to exist at all in Syria was in April 13. And then 8 months later, all the other rebel groups, or most of them, kicked out Daesh. And there is no evidence for direct supplies from or through Turkey to Daesh. So for a Libyan revolutionary leader politician, it couldn't be obvious that with their shipments they support Daesh. So I wonder who were the politicians you mentioned who have been in early contact with Daesh? And the second to Yasmin Al-Gamal, if you could elaborate a little bit about the situation in Sinai. How does it look like there? Who's in charge? Who has or which tribes, which groups have given loyalty to Daesh? Yeah.
The lady in the last row.
My question goes to Dr. Emna. I am wondering about the rehabilitation programs for foreign fighters, ISIS fighters abroad. What is the status of such programs in Tunisia? Who is working on them? Because I've heard of a European lobby, but like in Denmark, there are some success stories that integrate such fighters back into the community. But I would really like to know whether the stakeholders or the groups that are working on such matters within Tunisia and the government's concern and steps. Thank you.
Yes, hello. I've got two questions. The first is to Mohammed. I don't know if I understand you correctly, but you said that there was a Salafist uprising in Sirte against Daesh. Which is surprising to me, because in the first panel we heard that basically Salafism is a basis for Daesh's complete ideology. Yeah. So I would love if you could elaborate a little bit on the reasons for this uprising, because I find this really interesting. And the second question is to Yasmin. You said that the Daesh in Sinai simply has such movable capabilities that they can strike at any time that the Egyptian army can't keep up. But couldn't the reason for this also simply be that they are completely overextended? The Egyptian army, I mean, they recently opened the enlargement of the Suez Canal and these kind of things. So couldn't this also be the reason that they are unable to simply do these offensive operations in the peninsula of Sinai? That would be really interesting if you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
So let's have a break here. I'd like to start with Emna this time.
Okay. As far as rehabilitation programs, we're not at that stage yet, because first Tunisians were taken off guard and were in complete denial about the number of foreign fighters, until the international community started talking about it. And then after that, there is complete rejection by Tunisian society to talk about rehabilitation or reintegration. So far, there is no programs designed to reintegrate or rehabilitate these foreign fighters. All of them are either in jail or under surveillance. So, so far, nothing like what you've been mentioning.
Mohammed, would you like to take the next?
Yes. I was just trying to get the figures right. Yes, there was actually, the uprising was crushed by Daesh on the 15th of August, 2015. And it was led by Khalid bin Rajab al-Farjani, who belongs to the Farjan tribe in Sirte. And more than 200 people were killed within Sirte as a result of the uprising. So it is, I mean, sometimes some people want to argue that Sirte, because it was a stronghold of Gaddafi, so it was accepting of Daesh. It was not. 200 people were crushed, and everyone was watching them being crushed, Libyans and internationals, etc., and no one did much about it. Now, with regards to the question of the Salafists, and I did ask Abdullah earlier to possibly help me understand the situation a little bit better. The quietest or purest Salafists, those who follow the dominant Salafi trend in Saudi Arabia, and clerics or sheikhs like Rabi' al-Madkhali in the case of Libya is very influential. This group of Salafists is anti-Muslim Brotherhood, anti-Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, for example, anti-Ansar Sharia, and anti-ISIS. So in 2014, when Khalifa Haftar started his military campaign dubbed Operation Dignity in eastern Libya, the Salafists got a fatwa from their Sheikh Rabi' al-Madkhali to back Khalifa Haftar and fight against the other Islamist groups, if you like, that Khalifa Haftar is waging a war against. Now that Khalifa Haftar is gaining a lot of ground and becoming prominent and very strong, as a result, the Salafists, or those purist, quietist Salafists who follow clerics and scholars in Saudi Arabia, based in Saudi Arabia, are becoming more prominent. The issue that now we're facing, especially in eastern Libya, is that the Salafists are now trying to impose their own ideology on Libya. Similar, like social conservatism. They don't like books by Dan Brown or Paulo Coelho. They think no one should read them. And when we had books coming in, they confiscated them and took them. And when there was uproar and criticism by civil society and people, they went to the mosques and they started attacking those people who opposed them. And they stopped short of saying kill them, but basically said pressure them, expose them, let people know how corrupt they are, how morally corrupt, etc., and that they are trying to ruin the society. And recently they started to push for a travel ban on women, that women should not travel without a guardian. They're trying to push this through the system. They have controlled, for example, the Religious Affairs Authority in eastern Libya, and now they control many of the mosques in eastern Libya. But they are more, as I said, they don't like the Muslim Brotherhood, they don't like, they preach against them, Ansar Sharia, etc. And they are closer to what we see within Saudi Arabia. And that's why I earlier asked the question is, how does Saudi Arabia feel? How does the authority within Saudi Arabia and the religious establishment within Saudi Arabia feel about exporting such ideas to a conflict zone where there is a threat that this ideology could be misused, it could contribute to the conflict, it could create more problems than it would solve anything. So, the question...
It's about Wilayat Fizan.
Yes, Wilayat Fizan. I actually have two other questions. Do I have time? Is it? One, two.
You answer him and then we make another...
There is another question actually about the shipment. So very quickly. Wilayat Fizan. It was not active when there was Daesh in Sirte and in Derna. However, and also I'll add something to my answer to Ayman's question, is that there are sub-Saharan groups as well, and you have like some groups that have split from Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, you have Boko Haram, etc. And many of these groups are actually finding refuge in southern Libya. They're being pushed out of Nigeria, for example, Niger, and also in Mali. So they are actually regrouping there, and there are reports now, I think the surveillance by the United States and France is actually increasing there. And some French contacts tell me that there is an increase of French personnel and presence on the southern borders, possibly in your country. Yes. So the threat is definitely there, but there are numbers floated around, but there is not much being said. With regards to the question about shipments, very quickly, very early on, Mahdi al-Harati, who was the head of Tripoli's Revolutionaries Council or Revolutionaries Brigade, was one of the key people who were first to go to Syria, and he established what was known as Liwa al-Ummah there. And he was instrumental, along with other ex-Libyan Islamic fighting groups, such as Abd al-Hakim Belhaj, who has lots of contacts, and others, other names within the group who have contacts with Turkey and also with Qatar, very well established contacts. But I think Amna possibly will agree, and possibly through her research, she might have found some of this, that even Tunisian, when the Tunisian Nahda were in control in Tunisia, or where they were in power, they also were involved in a lot of these activities in trying to export fighters to Syria. in that regard, because they believe that Bashar al-Assad should be taken. Huh? Yeah, but the thing is, these activities have contributed somehow, even if indirectly. So some of the fighters, some of the weapons that have been transferred there have gone there. Like Al-Battar, for example, brigade, it was their movement to Syria was facilitated by these groups. Yeah, and then now they became Daesh, and then they returned to Libya to become Daesh or to establish Daesh in Derna. Well, some of them stayed in Syria, others are in Sirte, etc. So there was an impact. Obviously, Daesh came only in June or June 29th. That was the date when it was 2014, when it was established. But lots of the prior activities and prior events that have happened, they have helped the establishment of Daesh, definitely.
Okay, Jasmine.
Very quickly, just about the question about, someone asked up there in terms of more details on what's happening in the Sinai. I think one thing that I just want to point out that's different between the Sinai and, for example, somewhere like Raqqa, where ISIS had created a state originally. Sinai is a very target-rich environment for the Islamic State. They have multiple categories of villain in this area that they can use to recruit and that they can use to target. You have the Egyptian security forces, you have a minority population when it comes to the Christians, you have proximity to Israel, so it's very target-rich. And unlike in Raqqa, they don't govern, they don't, proclaim to be these benevolent rulers that you can come live here, you can live in the way of the prophet, we won't have corruption, like any of these sort of positive pull factors. You have just chaos and an incredible culture of fear. They, burning houses, beheading people, shooting people in front of their family members. It's just a total kind of spoiler role, and so it's a little bit different from other places in where they have territory. And then in response to the other question about whether the Egyptian military is overextended, I don't happen to believe that it is. I mean, they have more than enough people that they've deployed to the Sinai, so I don't necessarily think it's about the numbers. I think it's about a comprehensive strategy that actually isn't just simply tactical, counter-terrorism, like tit-for-tat kind of attacks, but a strategy that encompasses all of these different things. I haven't seen that. And I think that's more of the problem.
So this would be now the last round of 3 questions that I would take, and I have here 1, the lady second, and the gentleman third. And then I would close.
Mohammed, my question is for you.
Yes.
Let's assume that Daesh is militarily defeated, and Libya is after that. Okay, a Libya with fragmented, fully tribal society with no institutions so far, and with a government that doesn't feel at home. Who can get everyone in one room?
Who?
Who? I'm asking.
Yes, this control.
Thank you. Nelly Lahoud with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My question is to Jasmine. To what extent do you believe that Wilayat Sinai really dominates the landscape, the militant landscape in Sinai? When it first emerged, there were a number of other groups contending were operating in Sinai. And I'm wondering whether you think that its recent attacks, particularly targeting the Christians, does it sense any kind of competition, whether it's from Sinai or from groups, for example, that are on the rise in the rest of Egypt, such as Hasm, which has been really operating against the security forces?
Yes.
Yasmin, you talked about Daesh's proximity to Israel in Sinai. Are you aware, because I'm not, of any attack by Daesh on Israel, either there or on Golan or anywhere where it might try to have access? And why is it that it's not doing it? It should be, one would think, the top priority. In fact, it seems to be either very low or 0 priority. Can anybody explain that? Perhaps other members of the panel. Thanks.
So maybe we start now, this time with you, Jasmine, please.
To the first question, I think that the proclamation of loyalty in 2014 to the Islamic State really provided, so it was a very strategically smart and advantageous move for Wilayat Sinai, because it provided them with the brand recognition that a lot of other organizations don't have. ISIS is, for better or for worse, viewed as probably the top threat globally right now. And so aligning themselves with the group allow it to become, like, to set itself apart from all of these other places. And it also allows them to get so yeah, that's one thing is the name recognition, and then the other thing is because of their specific and very brutal attacks against the Coptic Christians and the security forces, they've managed to set themselves apart. So I would say that both territorially speaking and then just like strategic communications wise, they definitely are the most visible and the most prominent group in the Sinai that I can see right now. In terms of the attacks on Israel, so they have attempted to shoot several rockets towards Israeli territory in the last couple of years. Nothing major and nothing really successful, but enough so that the Israelis, as I mentioned earlier, are allowing the Egyptians to beef up their security presence in the Sinai. Israel has launched several drone strikes in the last couple of years on Wilayat Sinai targets, and so they do take the threat very seriously. However, I can only imagine, I mean, you asked why why Wilayat Sinai wasn't attacking Israel with more frequently or more success. I would imagine that the answer is because they know that if they incur the full wrath of Israel, that they would probably be decimated very quickly. And so they're not quite ready to take it to that level yet. It's enough for them in terms of recruitment just to say that Israel is next, or like we're close, But actually going head to head with Israel is a very bad idea for them.
Mohammed, there are a couple of questions that you need to answer, but I'll add one question
I will
to
answer
those.
only one question, yes.
Yeah, no, I'll add one to those questions. Yeah, I use the advantage of being a moderator. Can you say a couple of words about the local sport? Because it's surprising to actually see that in Tunisia there are so many foreign fighters joining, and I think there are some numbers indicating that up to 80% of the ISIS fighters are from Tunisia, but not really from Libya.
On the question of who can, I think that is what Dr. Tariq Mitri tried to do it. Many and 4 other UN envoys or 5 other UN envoys tried to do it, and they have not been able to. And also regional countries have tried to do it, and regional powers have tried to do it and have not been able to. I think only Libyans can actually bring Libyans to talk to each other. I think one of the main issues that we face in Libya is in eastern Libya, our leaders talk more to Egypt and to the UAE than they talk to their fellow Libyans in Misrata or in the west of the country. And leaders in the west of the country and in Misrata, they talk to the Turkish and the Qatari and the Italians more than they talk to their fellow Libyans in the east. And that is why I earlier wanted to emphasize the international role and the proxy war that is taking place in Libya. It is a major contributor to the instability, and it exacerbates the situation in Libya. But I think at the very end, it is up to us in Libya to decide that it is easier and more and wiser to actually talk to each other and fight possibly and about each other and to each other and what it means to be together than to allow foreign interests, because basically Libyan interests are getting lost in this maze, and now Russia is coming in as well to add to the mix with a wholly new different agenda as well, making the situation extremely difficult. So that is the answer to that. It's a very difficult question, but I think I go to the basic. I answered very, very simply there. Local support. I remember there are actually members of Daesh, Libyan members of Daesh within Libya, and there is a significant number of Libyans who've joined Daesh. within Libya. The reason that they don't go abroad is because they have a space to blow steam, if you like, in Libya. They don't need to go anywhere else. But generally, the society in Libya was very hostile towards Daesh, and so they were not very accepting of Daesh, the ideology, the practices. They are not very accepting of the purist and the quietist Salafists at the moment in Libya. There is a lot of opposition to a lot of the things that they want. No, women should be able to travel if they want to. Women should be able to drive. Many people are rising up against this. And this is how Libya has been from a social point of view under Gaddafi and also under the kingdom as well. So no, Libya was very hostile to Islamic State tactics and to whatever vision they had. It was not compatible with the Libyan mindset.
So I have the pleasure now to thank my panelists. Thank you, Emna, Mohammed, and Jasmine. And thank you all for this lively debate.